Welcome everybody to Pearlstone's Shavuot Sojourn. I am so glad to see all of your faces and that you all are here. I see some returners and I see some newcomers. So everyone, thank you. My name is Stern. I'm a lead educator here at Pearlstone. And this Shavuot Sojourn is an entire week dedicated to ancient grains, farming, and Jewish wisdom, which is so great. I'm so excited about it. And before we begin, please make sure that you are muted, but feel free if you have a question or a comment, you can either raise your hand and unmute yourself or post in the chat. This is a discussion, so we love everybody's input and questions. And on top of that, if you're comfortable with it, if your video is off, we invite you to turn it on. But again, whatever makes you feel most comfortable is great. So today we will be exploring how bread plays a central role in Jewish tradition and in so many cultures around the globe with Nili Simhai, who serves as the Director of Outdoor Education for Abundance Farm. She and the Director of Education here at Pearlstone, Sachia Lichtenstein, will be sharing an enlightening conversation this morning. And again, we're so glad that everyone's here to join it. So take it away, Sachia.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nili, for being here with us. The first question I want to ask is, what is your background? Is it a Zoom background? Oh, you're not. You're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I'm actually doing this crazy thing where I am starting a watch party on my Facebook of myself while I'm on here. So I'm going to see if that works. What's my background? You mean this physical background, Sachia? This is my closet.
Oh.
Yeah. We'll see what comes out of it during the interview.
That was going to be my next question. It's a view, or you could be in a tree. You might literally be inside of a tree.
It used to be a tree, for sure.
So the first thing that I would want to ask you is, especially with the title, is wheat. What is the connection between wheat and Jewish wisdom for you?
Yeah, so, we grow wheat at Abundance Farm. And I think that wheat is the central grain of the Jewish Torah narrative, right? Maybe that changes a little once we're in diaspora, once we're in exile and we're moving around. But for as long as we're talking about the Torah time of Judaism, wheat is sort of like what drives their imagination. It's the thing that that moment of harvesting wheat seems to be both in the Torah and for the rabbis, what's sort of like a pinnacle moment, so that it's associated with, the wheat harvest is associated with Shavuot, which is associated with the receiving of the Torah. So the rabbis sort of align the wheat harvest with this incredible, most important moment of receiving Torah, of revelation. So for me, it's all about the calendar. It just sort of grounds the calendar. For me, it's not any different than if you say, what's the wisdom of spring or winter? Like, the wisdom is that it comes back around every single year. It sort of grounds me in the Jewish calendar and in a land-based approach to the Jewish calendar. And then there's this other piece personally, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but there's this other piece personally that my family's from Iran. I'm an Iranian Jew. And there's all these songs, like the traditional old folk songs around wheat, because it's in that same part, of the world, the Levant, I believe it's called, that where was like the wheat bread basket of the ancient Near East. And so there's like love songs that involve wheat and songs of yearning that involve wheat. And I have to imagine that we must have had those also as an ancient people who lived in that part of the world. And I always wonder where those songs went. You know, where are our songs of like longing for the waving grains of wheat or the wheat harvest? That's just a few first thoughts about wheat in Judaism.
Have you felt that the sensuous uh, closeness with wheat that those songs are expressing, that like love and closeness? Have you felt that
With our little wheat bed, I have. You know, especially once we take the netting off. Like the wheat bed that we have at Abundance Farm is, I want to say it's probably 5 feet by 20 feet, 5 feet by 10 feet, somewhere in there. It's not huge. And in order to be able, for us to have any wheat at the end, we have to net it otherwise it's just too many birds to wheat. And like there are wheat fields here within a few towns of where I live that are obviously not netted because they're farmers just growing wheat. And they get birds too, but it's, you know, they have so much wheat, it's not a problem. That's something we asked a farmer once. We were like, how do you handle the birds? They said, we just grow a lot of wheat. But in our little wheat bed, we have a net. And yeah, this time of year when the heads are forming, you know, the seed heads are forming in New England, and you can sort of see it waving in the wind. And then as it dries out, and when we finally take the netting off and we actually do the harvesting by hand with knives, and some of us use some scythe-like instruments. It's a very tactile, sensuous experience, I would say. I feel it. It's in July, so it's a month or two off from the Shavuot cycle when it might, you know, and the Iranian song cycle when it might normally be happening. But yeah.
when did you first, I know also you have an interest in the natural world, in Hebrew is bechlal, period, in general. But when did that interest in wheat show up? When did you first notice it? I mean, I understand everyone, it's part of life. It's so ubiquitous that it's almost unnoticed. But when did you go, oh?
Yeah, so I think that it was, you know, probably 15 years ago or more when I had a teacher who was visiting. I used to work at an organization called Teva where we did Jewish outdoor ed, and I did no farming ed and no farming, and it's kind of a funny feeling sometimes that I landed in the farming part of outdoor ed, but that's where things are. And anyways, this teacher who came to our program, she put the idea in my head many years ago of like, you know, wouldn't it be cool to be able to grow wheat and to do all of the Mishnaic steps of work that are associated with making bread. So some of you might know the term av melachot, which are these like large categories of work. And I thought at the time that was a little heady and maybe like I wasn't so excited or interested in it. But 15 years later, that same teacher, I had this thought, I was like, oh, that was a brilliant idea. Once I ended up at Abundance Farm, because as an educator, you're just always looking for ways to make Torah come alive. So this suddenly hit me very quickly as like, oh, this would be if we grew wheat, there are so many different ways that we could tap into it educationally. And that's really what started us thinking that we should do it. So for us, we grow wheat, and depending on which age kid or school or grade that we're working with, we might be talking about challah making and Shabbat. We might be talking about the holiday cycles. We might be making matzah with it. We might be making challah, as I mentioned, or other bread. And we might be talking about those categories of work, those av melachot that I mentioned before, the categories of creative efforts in the world is how we like to translate them.
Yeah, I think Nili, I
Yeah.
think you have actually a beautiful way of languaging the 39 melachot. And could you take a little time to describe that for some of us that might not be so familiar with? And even if we are familiar with it, I
Sure.
think hearing you say it would be good.
Sure. And maybe while I'm doing that, Stern, if there's any way you could go to our website on the gears page, and like buying gear page, there's actually a link to a poster that we've created, and you could just grab that, and maybe we could pop it up. So there's these 39 of melachot, which means like parent or father categories of work. And they're understood to be, they're derived from actions that are obviously part of building the tabernacle in the Torah. So the rabbis went through and they were like, these 39 activities, this is what it took to build the tabernacle in the desert, and so the Mishkan. And so we're going to consider these like the foundational acts of creation. And that's how we interpret it. That's how we translate it on this poster that we've made. And of the 39, like, so imagine like 39 core categories of how we think the world works and how we think humans work upon the world. Humans, act upon the world, how humans are creative upon the world, how humans change the world. Of the 39 of them, 11 of them are associated with baking bread. And although they can apply to other actions, so for example, sorting is an act, is sort of considered like a foundational act of creativity. You can sort all kinds of things. It can apply to all sorts of things. But they originally sort of like derived that sorting was an act of work by looking at the bread baking process and being like, oh yeah, there's that step where you have to sort out the parts you want from the parts you don't want. You have to sort out the wheat grains from any remaining chaff that's in there. So it's kind of cool that like the bread baking is considered sort of the model for how we do creative work in the world. One of the core models for how we do creative work in the world. That's kind of cool.
It certainly is. It also, one of the things that came up in another one of our sessions was how the word lechem, bread, in Hebrew means, and this goes back to the idea in English of corn being like the staple grain, your staple sustenance. So in the US, corn is maize, and in England, it's wheat. But lechem, bread, which is sustenance in a sense, in Hebrew means bread from grains, and in Arabic, where and learn this from the Bedouin, it means meat.
Huh?
So in some ways that word in a very ancient or archaic way might have meant sustenance, and depending on if your culture is primarily farming with some meat, or primarily nomadic with just a couple grains, you would give the word to whatever you were eating, which is really interesting. Oh, so we actually have up on the screen, Nili, would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, that is really interesting about lechem meaning meat in Arabic. I hadn't learned that before. That's cool. So what you're seeing in front of you, as you can see, it's stamped with sampled, nice and big. But this was a poster that we commissioned. Actually, it did not exist in the world before a few years ago. And we commissioned a great Jewish educator and artist named Matt Tonti to make it for us. And what it is it's just the 11 melachot, the 11 foundational acts of creation that are used for making bread. And the thing that I think we're most proud of about it is it's not that, these illustrations or even of kids doing these acts didn't exist in the world before, but this is sort of the first modern interpretation of it, with like a lot of diversity of types of Jewish people doing the activities or types of humans doing the activities, and also ages and things like that. And it's fun and kid friendly and adult friendly. And then you can see on the bottom left is the blessing for eating bread. And there's a lot of little chestnuts hidden in there. So this is just something we're really proud of, and we use this as a teaching tool. My favorite is, I don't know if you can see it that well because the word sample is across the top of it, is the kid right in the middle doing threshing. Yeah, that guy right there who's just like happily beating on a bag of wheat. I have a lot of kids like that. It's just such a joyous experience to thresh for kids and adults. Let's be honest. I have a lot of adults who come through and do threshing with us who are so happy to just thresh and winnow.
He looks like he's going to smash that hammer through the table. He's like,
yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So one of the things that I'm really amazed and curious about when it comes to Abundance Farm is how its physical location was so carefully chosen and how it determines the kind of work that you all do. I mean, and I was hoping that you could talk about that.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if it was chosen or if it was fated or luck. I like to believe it was fated, the second one, and I'll tell you why in a second. So I don't know, Stern, if we might have that picture. I did find it it's under location on the website. Stern is awesome. It's just like fishes stuff off the website for us.
Yeah. Just you do your thing. I'll
do my thing. Okay, so here's the deal. Abundance Farm is a 1 acre farm. Until recently, we said a 1 acre farm. We now actually have received a gift of being able to farm on another extra acre a couple blocks down. That's someone's second lot of their home. So now we have to say 2 acres. But until very recently, it was a 1 acre lot. That where the primary part, the original 1 acre is, so this is the farm. It goes sort of a rectangle, long and skinny. If this is the farm, right here, here it comes. So you see at the bottom there, it says, so the farm is all the stuff that looks like a rectangle, the purple rectangle, the yellow circle, the green circle, all the way back to the green circle, right? But right next to it is where it says Congregation B'nai Israel is the synagogue. And then right next to that, where it says Lander Grinspoon Academy, is our little Jewish day school, K through 6. And the part that you can't see, it says shared parking lot with the Northampton Survival Center. So imagine there's a parking lot there, and then right across that parking lot is our local food pantry that serves, the entire county. So a big operation. And the farm was created from the beginning as a co-sponsorship between all 3 of those organizations. And it serves all 3 of those organizations, plus, you have to kind of think about the fact that the synagogue includes a preschool and includes a religious school. So there's actually more schools that we're serving than you can really see in this map, but plus the broader community, like, the whole neighborhood and beyond. So from the beginning, we've had this blessing of being really deeply embedded in a real community, like a community that has to come and go to this space all the time for all kinds of other things. You gotta go drop off your kid, you gotta come for Minyan, you gotta, do whatever else it is you do recreationally. In our synagogue, there's seems to be 30 different committees doing 30 different things. The building is constantly full of people. And the farm has proven, just this is a side note, this isn't maybe what we're talking about today, but the farm has proven that it is a really interesting and accessible feeder for all those Jewish organizations. So from the perspective of the Jewish organizations, not only are they getting not only are they getting an educational space and educational staff from the farm, and a place to go pray and have beauty and respite. But it's also bringing in people who wouldn't normally step into those buildings for all kinds of reasons. It's bringing people who are willing to step outside of those buildings and have Jewish experiences outside of those buildings. And then often they're willing to then take a step into the building and try one new thing, let's say. And some of them do continue on to do very high barrier things like enroll their kids in a Jewish day school or become a synagogue member. So that's pretty cool. And then you'd asked me about how we chose it. We didn't really choose it. It just happened to be an acre that the synagogue had bought, thinking one day we'll do something with this acre. Maybe we'll build on it or whatever. And they've been holding on to it since it went up for sale. And then some families started doing some kind of guerrilla gardening there. And they built a cob oven and put in a few trees and a little vegetable garden, maybe sort of about the size of where it says growing in the green there. And by the time that Rabbi Jacob Fine came on the scene and he saw, the green where it says growing. Nope, still not even that. Right in the middle. The original farm, the original little guerrilla garden was about that big in the middle part. And he came and he saw them doing, he saw that little guerrilla garden there and he saw that whole extra rest of that acre. And he said, what if, what might it look like? And he proposed the idea to the synagogue, and that's how we started. And we expanded on the work of those couple, like 3 families that had just been sort of doing it for themselves and the community, for a bunch of years. But I think the other reason why it feels like it's faded is because it turns out that our farm used to be, until the 1950s, what the poor farm or the alms farm for all of Northampton. Whoa. Meaning that this acre plus another 17 acres behind it was a working farm where people who needed housing and or food could come live there and work the land and eat of the produce. So it has a long history of being used for food security and food justice. And so it kind of, I think it wants to stay in that mode. That's my
it seems like the land she remembered and she wanted to go. She's like, I want to go back to that.
Yeah, 100%.
I hear how the model has helped the community to have the farm there. I was wondering if you had a moment, if you could talk about how this model of being so closely wedded for a farm to be so closely wedded to a synagogue and to a community, how has that helped the farm? And I'm thinking particularly in the time that we are in right now, which is COVID, in particular, but just in general, how does that relationship help the farm?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing to know about Abundance Farm, when we talk about the 3 pillars of our work, we'll mention education, we'll mention justice, and we'll mention community. Those are sort of if you look in our logo, those are the 3 pillars that are underneath our logo. And what I like to say is that even the social justice, the food justice work, and the education work, they're all most intertwined. I mean, they're all intertwined with each other, but they're most intertwined in building community. So that's a lot of what Abundance Farm is doing. And if you're in the business of building community as your sort of like foundational act that you're doing, it helps a lot to be part of an existing thriving community. Do you know what I mean? It sounds sort of circular, but
it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, some things, having worked at a nonprofit before, one thing that I still remember being sort of a little bit shocked by was the first time, and I'm not going to say it's always easy to fundraise at Abundance Farm. I don't want anyone to get this idea. It was the first time that we asked it was like the very first year, and someone said, let's raise $10,000. And someone said, okay, let's just try to get 100 people at $100. And there just was 100 people right there, to ask. There were hundreds of people right there to ask that were already part of an existing community and that wanted to see this as a growth in their community. And so it's very much like it's a cycle that feeds itself. Like we were able to create what we were able to create because of the community, and then we were able to really grow the community and grow the work that's happening there because of what we're doing. And there, there's as a Jewish educator, it's really grounding to have to answer to the needs of like the religious school director and the preschool director and the day school director. They have like standards they need to hit and things that need to happen. And so you end up creating curriculum, I think, that gets sort of tested very quickly, and you weed out the stuff that's, maybe you thought was a great idea and you're so excited about, but actually isn't maybe a need. It gets iterated very quickly. So as an educator, it's been amazing. It's also just like so many people come through on any given day. On a non-COVID May Wednesday, we would get like 9 or 10 different hits of a preschool group and then a day school group and then the whatever. There's just a lot of, you're living in a real community, and then those people are the people who you are having drinks with and seeing in the Kiddush line at the synagogue. And so it's very real. It's very grounded, I guess.
I can get the picture of that cycle. And that it makes me think of, I'm wondering, you talked about how wheat lends itself to the educational model, like how well those skills and even ancient laid out pedagogy actually is so alive, and also how the farm works with the community. And we have a question here, and also just the wheat itself, the plant, the grass, the being, how does it lend itself to community building? And I'm thinking in particularly like the attributes and nature of it. How does it lend itself?
Well, one thing I would say is it's slow growing. That was my first thought, is it's slow growing. And so in that way, I know in the Jewish environmental ed world, where I've lived for quite a number of years, both as a human in the world and as my career, we're often faced with sort of these like one touch, someone comes in for a half hour and it's like, how can you catch their attention and connect them to nature and teach them something? And so that actually lends itself more to something where there's a lot of immediate gratification, like, here, did you know you could eat this wild herb that I can show you right here? Whereas with wheat, it's quite the opposite. We plant it in September. We get as many of the subgroups, that are interested and available to help plant it. So there's like, in our not so big bed, there's 20 rows or whatever it is, and each class comes through and does one row. The preschoolers like put in one seed at a time. I work with 3-year-olds, so some of them like literally only place one seed in. Some of them put in a few rows depending on their age. And that happens in September in New England. So we're on the New England cycle, not exactly the same thing as the Eretz Israel cycle. It's a longer cycle, so it goes from September through July, whereas the Israel cycle goes from after Sukkot, so imagine November-ish, through to Shavuot, so imagine 1st of June-ish, right? So it's shorter on both ends of the cycle by a month or two. Anyway, so then we planted in September, and then you know what a lot of my curriculum is? Let's go out and look at the wheat. Like we just go and look at it, and then then we'll talk a little bit and we'll be like, let's see how it looks. And then sometimes we'll be like, let's learn about the omer. And then we go and stand next to the wheat and we count the omer standing next to the wheat. Or we go inside and we're making challah, which we probably bought the flour from the store because we don't make enough wheat, store our own flour. You can make a little flour out of it, mostly for the learning purposes. But, we might make some challah and then it'll be the dead of winter and we'll say, let's go look at the wheat. And, and that's a lot of the nature of the wheat for us, is that it's slow growing and it's there all year and it's interesting what happens to it. And I can come back to it again and again. And I think there's something about that is, like building community. It's not instantaneous. You got to keep revisiting it. I don't know. I could probably go on. It's prickly, as community is sometimes.
and also they're in a field, right? So they're like all together in a very communal, as opposed to like a lone tree in a savanna or something.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
Wheat is only with its friends. A single wheat,
Single wheat isn't that exciting. I mean, it might be exciting, but it's not that useful to human beings. Whereas a single tree is very useful to a human being, right?
You mentioned the bakery, or you mentioned making challah, and I think that's also another interesting branch of education that you have there. You have a community oven. And a bakery. So can you describe that?
So it's kind of incredible. This cob oven, which is an oven that's made of mud and straw, has been there since before, during the guerrilla gardening days that I told you about. One of the families that planted some of the original stuff got excited and built a cob oven too. And it's the same cob oven. It's been sort of patched up and repaired a few times. And it works remarkably well. And for, I would say, the first 5 or 6 years that we had Abundance Farm, we might fire it up once a year or twice a year. We would use it to make pizza at Sukkot. We have a big Sukkot harvest festival, and so pizza was like a very exciting thing to make our own pizza. And then after a few years of that, we added a communal matzah baking day, which is, again, more of educational matzah. I think some people use the matzah for their seders, but it was mostly people coming and being like, this is cool. And then a lot of like 3-year-olds eating the matzah right away. And a lot of older people, I don't know, eating their matzah right away too. So, and that was all we did with it for the last few years. And then this really cool young gentleman in our community, Sam Coates-Fink, who makes bread and who builds cob ovens, started to come around and just be like, hey, can I just fire up the oven? And he'd just fire it up, and like loaves of delicious bread would come out of it and people would gather. And for, I don't know, about 6 months, this would just keep happening. Just whenever Sam felt like it, he would be like, hey, is it okay if I fire up the oven? And there would be potlucks around it, and people would immediately, I mean, it's just the most delicious bread in the world. And people would just immediately gravitate. Very organic, grassrootsy, people just show up kind of thing, potlucks, that kind of thing. And then we had a visit from, I want to make sure I get their names right. Jonathan and Linda, Jonathan Rubenstein and Linda Motzkin, unless I've reversed their last names. They're this very cool couple. You should look them up, called Bread and Torah. They live in Saratoga Springs, New York, upstate New York. And they're 2 rabbis who share a synagogue pulpit, and then also both have other projects besides the synagogue. And Jonathan's project is bakery, and Linda's project is writing Torahs. She's a Torah scribe. So they come and they do like programs, like bread and Torah, and you learn about bread and you learn about Torah. It's very cool stuff. And we were watching Jonathan, and he explained to us that they have a bakery in the basement of their synagogue. And he talked about what a community building aspect of the synagogue it is. It's a working bakery. They bake once a week, and then you can order your challah ahead of time and come pick it up. And I just remember Jacob and I looking at each other and being like, oh, we need one of these. We need to do that. And because Sam was on sort of like around and whatever, and an excellent baker, you know, and certainly knew his way around cob ovens, they had a conversation. And so now, not right now because of COVID, but outside of COVID, we have had bi-weekly bakery, order ahead, challahs, onion rise. Oh my God, these sesame cookies. I should just stop because it's going to make all of our mouths water. These bagelas, these incredible things. And similar to when Abundance Farm opened and we said, look at all these people it's bringing in. We've never seen these people. You know, every time we do a new program at Abundance Farm, we're like, oh my gosh, how come we've never seen these people at the synagogue or at the school? Who are these people? You know, so the first time we did a program where people showed up, where we had like a, you know, little kids tots singing program with puppets and musician, but outdoors, not inside the synagogue, outdoors, not inside the school, outdoors on the grass on the farm with blankets. All kinds of people showed up that we don't normally ever see in any other sort of situation in the community. Similar with the bakery, all of a sudden, all these people came out of the woodworks who only walk into the synagogue building and never came out to the farm. And this was their first time coming out to the farm. People came out who were farm regulars, synagogue regulars, school regulars, and then a whole bunch of new people we'd never met before. And it just is a great way to build community. I believe we're at the point where it might just be breaking even financially, and we're hoping that eventually it might even be a moneymaker. And it's just another, like the hearth is such a central part of what defines a community. And communal ovens in Jewish communities throughout the diaspora is such a central part of what defined a Jewish community, like a Jewish communal oven.
Could you, I would love if we could get into that just a little, that people might not understand, like the connection between the community oven and Shabbat and what that meant. Like,
yeah, and others might know more about this than I do, because I feel like it's one of those things I've always wanted to learn more about. I'll talk about the parts I know. Certainly for matzah, my understanding is that people baked matzahs. Often people baked their own matzah, but in a communal oven, or there was one oven for the whole, whatever the Jewish community is, that was only ever used for matzah once a year. And so maybe there were people who were working it, and you came up and you ordered, but it was sort of like the communal, the same way it's a communal property, the same way the synagogue might be a communal property or the mikveh might be a communal property, this matzah oven was considered a communal property. I know that that was the case in Tehran, that my mom told me that, you know, they as kids would go, you know, that my grandmother would like get in a taxi, go very far away because we didn't live right in the Jewish community, and set aside like a half day of waiting to get all of her matzahs into a big blanket, get back in the taxi and go back. And that's how you got matzahs. And I've seen pictures of communities in Ukraine and Yemen. It just seems like that was the commonest way to do matzah, as in a communal oven.
I've operated them. They're still in existence, and there's lots of bakeries that are pretty much closed. They seal them off, and then they open them up, and then everyone comes and it's baking and baking and baking nonstop.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's certainly not, not everybody's getting their matzahs out of boxes even nowadays. And I know that in certain communities, there's a very high value put on making your own. And so you can arrange for a time slot in the communal matzah baking oven when you and your family can come and make your own. And then, your hour is up and the next person comes in.
Yeah, and if you were very dedicated, you would actually make your own. And there would be many Rebbes. I lived in Miami, and they would be taking their breaks sort of in Miami. And right around Pesach time, they would be in the backyards. They would all, I guess, like if you were like very dedicated to Pesach. You would make your own matzah oven in the backyard, and on after chametz was already removed after the burning, then that noontime right before Pesach would
Oh my
actually
gosh.
bake matzah right then for the seder, like, you could see it happening. Um,
That's
and
incredible. I hadn't heard about that timing of it. But can I tell you another one that I have heard of? One of the teachers I work with said that when she was on kibbutz in Israel as a youngster, her host family that she lived with on the kibbutz that sort of adopted her. I don't remember what their background is. Maybe Syrian Jewish was this family, but don't quote me on that. Their tradition was to make their own oven from scratch before Pesach, out of mud in their backyard. Like they just walked in their backyard right before Pesach and like made a tiny little mud oven from scratch, baked their matzah in it, and then it was gone and they built a new one the next year. So Jews have been making matzah in all kinds of funky ways for a very long
I have
time.
which relates to that story. I have a Yemenite friend, a Taimani Jew, who the story about his grandparents that he and his family tell, and they watched it, was that when after they walked from Yemen to Israel and finally made a place where they could have their neighborhood, he walked to the closest tree that he could find, and he sat down and he opened up his Zohar and he started teaching. And she walked next to the tree, built a cob oven, and started making pita and matzah for everyone in the neighborhood. And that drew everyone together. And every morning, everyone would show up. They would eat bread, they would learn Torah, and then they would go off to work. And that they did, according to this family, they did that right when they arrived, and they never stopped. So like they just continued doing it. And it was like just bread and wisdom and community just being like drawn towards it, like in a circle.
Wow. It's like Shavuot every day, a little taste of it, a little Torah, a little bread. That's a beautiful story. Yeah, bread just brings people in. It really, it's sort of like a signal to gather and to be in community.
I also know that the community oven would be like in the center of the town, and you would people would be baking bread before Shabbat, and then once the bread was finished baking, then you would go and take your hot pot or your chalent or
Yeah.
kamim or whatever, and you go and you would put it. So the ovens were hot from baking the bread, and then you would put your pot in there. Then you would cover it up, and then Shabbat morning, everyone would come and get it. So you have this like rolling in and out of movement from in and out of the pot, that is out of the oven, which is like surrounding Shabbat. Like,
Yeah, I've heard that story before too, and I've also I know one or two people who have sort of rogue put in their cholents into the oven after the bread baking. I mean, they asked, but like it was just sort of like a little on the DL.
We have a couple of oven and hearth related questions in the chat. From Tome, she asks, what is the difference in baking bread in a cob oven versus a gas or electric oven? And then there's a really cool comment from Zoe about an Italian matzah oven underground somewhere in Pitigliano, where people fell in love.
Oh yeah, I'm just reading that comment from Zoe. All this stuff was underground.
So, does someone want to read it? Maybe just if people are listening. It says the classic cuisine of Italian Jews by Ida Survey Machlin writes about growing up in
Pitigliano.
a town with a Jewish community for 1,000 years until the Nazis. Now the Jewish area is a museum. It has a secret matzah oven dug into the soft tufa rock under the town. This is almost like a Dr. Seuss pronunciations. There also were other religious activities underground in the tufa. Synagogue, kosher slaughterhouse. You can go see it. Matzah baking was a great communal time, and apparently romances started when people were baking their matzah for Pesach. Well, baking and is very central. You know?
That's so cool. To answer Tom's question, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe somebody else can answer it. Here's the thing, I'm not the baker. I'm not even that, I'm kind of a horrible baker actually in my own house because I don't like following recipes. I'm a really good cook, I like to think. So, but I have to imagine it has something, if in case you don't know how a cob oven works, I can at least explain the mechanics and we can imagine what the difference might be. So a cob oven is mud and straw that's been sort of made into a dome with a hollow in the middle and then something used as a door, often a wooden door actually, or ours is wooden with like a sheet of metal on the inside so it doesn't burn as quickly. And the way you use it is you first build a big fire in it with wood, and then you take that fire out. And what's happened is the whole oven has gotten very hot, and because it's earth and stone, the base of ours actually has bricks or stone in it as well. It retains that heat for a long time, for hours and hours. So there's actually, and again, like we talked about, the wheat is very slow. Our baking is very slow also, which is also an excellent way to build community. Now I'm remembering, people come like at the beginning of the process, they linger at the end of the process, they linger after the bakers are gone. But it is time intensive. So the bakers have to come and heat up the oven. Sometimes they even come the night before, or they come very early in the morning. And they heat up the oven, which is a several hour process. Then they take the stuff out and it's sort of like just at the right temperature. They bake for a bunch of hours and then there's sort of like the descending part of the cycle where, as Safia mentioned, you could put in something else to cook, whether it's a cholent, or we had a Muslim Moroccan family come in and put their couscous in there, their couscouserie, and have some couscous, a couscous potluck after a bunch of bread baking was done one time. So I have to imagine something about that slower, hotter heat is part of what makes it allows you to just keep the oven hot for a while, but also like with a slow buildup and a slow descent.
And I know that matzah bakeries, the ones that it's shmura matzah and they're baking it by hand, most of the time those are all done with wood fire. It's not like it's an electric oven. They're purposely baking, and they can bring it up to like a really, really high temperature.
Yeah.
There's also another bread that we're forgetting, and actually it's connected to the reference to the tufa, the underground bakery, is bagels. And it's not Persian Jewish tradition, but it's still okay, and
I like to eat bagels.
in love with bagels, and there's so much romance around the original bagel, not the thing that people eat now, but there was actually one of the rules of bagel baking was that the bagel had to be baked underground. If you baked a bagel above ground, it really wasn't a bagel. That's not a bagel. A bagel needs to be baked underground. And there were bagel unions, and if you were caught baking bagels above ground, then there would be serious repercussions. The art of the way in which you'll bake this bread, it has so much romance and like dedication to it. It's just enormous.
Is that right? The Lower East Side bagel bakeries were mostly underground?
Yeah, they had to be.
I had no idea.
You get your window smashed if they saw that you were going above ground.
Wow.
Yeah. Amongst other things, many different rules that have to do with bagel baking.
Okay, can we go off subject for just 1 minute?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay.
Actually, before we go off subject, let's go off subject. But
Okay.
Stern, could we cap this because we're coming to our hour, and then we'll go into the Q&A part, which is off subject.
I agree. I was going to suggest the same thing. So we have come to our hour, as Psache said, that in our sojourn time generally represents the time when we are acknowledging that it has been an hour, and if people need to be somewhere else, as in not on the Zoom call, please take your leave if you need to. But the conversation still feels a bit alive. So we're going to keep it going for another 10 or 15 minutes in a sort of Q&A format in the chat, or based on Nili's desire to take it on a tangent, which we are all very excited about, I'm sure. So for those of us who do have to leave us, thank you so much for joining us today. There are many more speakers in our Shavuot Sojourn. It continues tomorrow also. But the next lecture is with Pearlstone's very own Joe Murray on Tending the Wild or the Midbar, which is today at 4 o'clock. You can register for those sessions anytime on Pearlstone's website at pearlstonecenter.org/Shavuot 2020. Thank you. And like many other nonprofit organizations around the country, Pearlstone is facing some kinds of financial hardships in this moment. So if you like the programming that we've been offering, please consider making a donation. We'd really appreciate it. You can do that on our website at pearlstonecenter.org/donate. And lastly, if you enjoyed this session also, we're starting a bread group with the first speaker in our sojourn, Eli Ragosa, that'll offer, it's a network of people that will offer tips on growing ancient grains, sourdough, and lots of other stuff, with such a generous contribution from Ellie offering to send seeds of ancient grains to people so that it can be spread around the country and the world, hopefully.
Wow.
More about that at pearlstonecenter.org/hamotzi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank
Stern.
you.
Nili, are you going to lead us off the path?
Okay, it's just a very quick tangent because you said get your windows smashed in, and I said Lower East Side, and then we were also talking about bread and meat. If you haven't heard of the Lower East Side meat strike of 1902 or 4 or whatever it is, you really have to look it up. I learned about that this year. I could not believe it. It blew my mind. That's my tangent.
Well, look it up.
I second that.
Yeah, Google it. I can't, do you remember, Stern, if it's 02 or 04 or 06? I can't remember.
It was in that decade.
Yeah.
But yeah, people in the streets talking about the meat price and how it was too damn high.
Women in the streets.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there, it was like across the country that there was like, along with all the other monopolies at the turn of the century, meat industry was a monopoly. There was only meat coming from one place. And even the kosher meat came through this one place, just like they had like a kosher division or something. And they raised the price so high. And the butchers tried to strike against the industry and weren't able to hold a strike. But then once the women started to strike, then not only was it effective on Lower East Side, but it spread to other Jewish communities. Women got up out of the women's section of the synagogue, stormed the bima, and demanded that the rabbis tell all the congregants that they weren't allowed to buy meat. And they had the whole thing wrapped up in 2 weeks. I just love this story. So I encourage you to look it up. That's my tangent.
I dropped a link in the chat. You were dead on. It was 1902.
Oh, awesome.
And it is related, as Pam says in the comments, that since bread and meat are related words, lachem, It's and bread is typically mixed with meat in the Levant in particular. Why do we connect bread with dairy for Shavuot?
That's a great question. Do you want me to field that question?
Sure.
My understanding about dairy and Shavuot is that it's a logical time for there to be an influx of dairy. And I've learned this, honestly, I'm just repeating what I've learned at places like Pearlstone and Isabel Friedman. And Jack, actually, I believe, taught me this once too, that there's just an influx of dairy at that time because that is when the young goats and sheep are being weaned from their mamas. That's what we do for dairy. We encourage and help facilitate our herds to have children. And then after a little while, we say, okay, stop feeding the children the milk. And then we take the milk for ourselves. So that's a very, very simplified understanding of how the dairy industry works without any of the ugly details. I eat a lot of dairy, so I take that on. And so that happens, that lines up right around now, which is when Shavuot is. And so oftentimes I think is sort of like another circular thing, which is like, well, I bet you people were having a lot of dairy and they were and it was Shavuot. And so they were like, well, what does dairy have to do with Shavuot? And also I'm sure it was like, they were experiencing Shavuot and they were like, what's the quintessential food that's going to represent my spiritual reality right now? And they looked around and what was available was dairy stuff. And so they made whole meals around that with cheeses. And later on, in this community, certainly this diaspora community, the cheesecakes. And then there is another story about how it all relates. But I think, I personally think that must have been secondary. That the primary reason, there's all these like descriptions of like how.
Bodies first.
Yeah.
The
So
bodies first, that's for sure.
That's what I know. Anyone want to add anything else about dairy?
Yeah, I could add a very interesting aspect of that. And in the same way that Nili talked about milk and the weaning time being a Shavuot time, having raised goats and sheep, that's verified. It's totally true. That's what happens right at that time. That's what's happening, especially if you're raising them in a family way where you're not removing the babies from the mothers until like right away, because in an industry they are doing that. But when once Shavuot comes around, it's a very comfortable time to do that. It's the mother's already done. She's like, please keep this thing away from me. And so it's really like it doesn't feel harmful at all. And in many of our holidays, like why do we have apples during Rosh Hashanah? Right, and so there's many beautiful understandings of why we have apples during Rosh Hashanah, but apples are there during Rosh Hashanah. That's the fact that they're there is coming from the creator of this nature and coming from the creator of creation. So it's seen as like a communication, like, oh, there's something about apples that their very nature comes in right at this time, and so what does that mean to me? And then I get a teaching or a guidance or a story about why apples come in at that time. And that's where it's like, oh, so I understood it from the creator. But the apples coming in came first, because that's how I know to even think about why they relate to Rosh Hashanah. The very interesting thing about Shavuot, actually, is that an older custom, now for many Jews, the custom is to have a dairy meal for Shavuot. So even when they're eating animals or animal products, right? For most holidays, they'll eat meat, but on Shavuot, it's a dairy. But actually, the older custom is to have two meals. To have a dairy meal, stop the meal, and then have a meat meal. And that is sort of the physical enactment of the separation between milk and meat. right? So it's like the in Shavuot is like this the cutting, the separations, and so you're having this like milk, and then you eat bread, and then you eat meat, you know, to cleanse your palate. And so then it's like not just that I don't eat milk and meat, but here I am doing this like physical ritual of I am separating between milk
Right.
and meat. Like it's the meal of that, and it happens on Shavuot. I actually have met some traditional Jews that still do that. It's a I've been part of those meals, but it's they're rare.
It sounds very filling. Dairy, then bread, then meat.
uh, Nili, I wanted to ask you, what are you most curious about right now about wheat? What's most interesting to you?
Well, right before COVID, I mean, like right before, maybe a week before, I was at Pearlstone for the Jewish Farmers Network get together. And I went to the pre-conference with at Migrash Farm with Ian. And he sort of threw this teaser in that I feel like I really need to learn a lot more about, which is that he maintains, and I believe him, he taught me, that actually like much of the land of Israel during the time of, during what we would think of as biblical times, during Torah times, wasn't that fit for growing wheat. It was actually much more fit for growing barley. And that had to do something with like how the land had been sort of overused to some extent, and the soil acidity had changed, and so it just wasn't good for planting wheat anymore. And so he taught that like actually all this sort of like longing and pining and yearning to reach the pinnacle of the Omer with the wheat harvest was maybe even historical. Like, so, and this is where I get a little lost. Like, I don't totally understand it and I want to learn more about it. So I'm very interested in this question. And maybe if I had watched the session with Eli Ragosa, I would know the answer to this. But to this question of like, when and how much and to what extent was wheat really able to be grown in biblical times in the land of Israel? That's something I'm curious about. And just that whole story, the whole historical story of wheat from like a archaeological point of view, I suppose, an anthropological point of view. I'd love to learn more about that.
Luckily, you can watch Eli Ragosa's lecture if you go to pearlstone.org, pearlstonecenter.org/Shavuot 2020 and click on her thing. You'll be able to put in your name and email and get a link to the video.
Does she talk about this?
I don't know if she specifically addresses that, but you'll definitely learn something.
She does talk about emmer being the wheat, that emmer being the wheat that we're talking about. And actually, when you mentioned that about barley, I was like, oh yeah, barley, I can't believe we started. She likes, and she prefers the word ancient grains rather than to get like, we, because of, I guess, a cultural bias, just went straight to wheat and just used that word over and over and over again. But actually, barley was just as important, and Omer starts off with barley and continues, and most people were eating barley, not just the animals. And like barley is like, wheat is like the refined. It's actually part of the offering of those 2 loaves of bread is kind of like the most rarefied, finest flour you could have, which is wheat in its most refined and fine processing. That's like ta-da! But that was not the normal food that people were eating. They were not eating that kind of like.
Yeah. that I mean, you get a little bit of a sense of that from the Talmud, that like wheat is considered the high refined grain, and barley kind of the common coarse everyday grain and things like that. But I think that this session I had with Ian was the first time I really learned that it just wasn't, there just wasn't nearly that much of it around. It just wasn't that common. It was high end all the time. So curious to learn more about that.
I'm curious about if you have resources that you could share with people that helped you along the way in your journey with ancient grains.
You mean like great books I read and things like that? No.
Like,
I mostly just read the Torah. I recommend the Torah.
What everyone says.
Read the Torah, and honestly, I do a lot of this kind of learning from my peers. So I've probably learned more from some of the people on this call about wheat than from, I've learned more from those folks than I have from any book. I did pick up a really interesting, it's so funny to mention, I picked up a book right before COVID and from the library, and it was all about ancient grains. And I said to myself, now is the time for me to read this. And sitting on my office desk, where I'm not allowed to even go in my office anymore. So, and the libraries have sort of waived all the fines. So it's just been sitting there for 2-3 months, whatever it's been.
Well, Nili, I know that everyone, many of us on this call have learned a tremendous amount from you, not just today, in a much broader way. So thank you, Nili.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I should also probably head out soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was a joy. I really love this format, by the way. As a teacher, this is like such a great, easy format for just talking and sharing and listening and looking at other people's contributions. So I commend you guys on that. And to Stern and Clara for teching in the back there. Chag Sameach. Happy Shavuot to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nili, before you go, actually, my daughter, Ahava, she was married right before Purim. And
Mazel tov.
Thank you. Her husband, Hadar Maimon, I hope this is not live on Facebook. Are we still live on Facebook?
Yes.
Yes,
is.
you
Hold
are.
on. Let me stop. I'll trim this part too.
He's his ancestry is Persian Jew.
Hey, Mazel tov doubly then.
So finally, I've got some cred with you.
No, you always had credit with me, but now finally you're going to get some really good food if he does any of the cooking.
I was thinking, do you have resources for? I took him to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at some of those unbelievable Persian rugs that they've got there, but I think there's more that he could learn about these songs about wheat and.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. I'll send you the classic one or two of the classic songs about wheat. Those I'm always happy to share. Every Shavuot, I'm like, who should be hearing this song? So there's actually a really cool Israeli singer right now who's singing them too.
Oh, so that's it. I know who should be hearing the song. So send them this way.
All right. Awesome. Will do. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Chag
Chag Sameach. Bye.
Yeah.